Mark Devlin, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
What's up, brother? Good to be with you.
I was taking my dogs this morning to the parlor, and I was listening to some old school punk rock, Lillingtons and NoFX. I'm not sure if you're a punk rock guy yourself, but I guess what I want to ask you is what's in your playlist right now?
Well, that's a very good question. In terms of punk rock, I was never really a big fan of the genre. I do remember a lot about it because I grew up in the 1970s, and I can remember a friend of mine, when we were both 7, went out and bought the Sex Pistols. And I can't remember what the A-side was, but the B-side was Friggin' in the Riggin'. And it's a very dirty, smutty sailors sort of song. And he had to keep it a secret from his dad. His mum knew that he bought the record. She gave him the money. But he had to keep it a secret from his dad because he would have gone mad and said, well, taken a hammer and broken it up probably. So that's one of my memories of the punk era. And I can remember all those bands coming through in the late 70s and stuff. I remember hearing them play on the radio, but I was never really into that. I was more of a black music guy. So I was into pop music, whatever was in the charts, up until my teenage years. And then a school friend turned me on to black dance music in the mid-80s. So this was soul, funk, early rap and hip-hop, early house music. And I got into all of that. And when I became a DJ, that was the route that I took. I played primarily R&B, hip-hop, reggae. And that took me all over the world, as we were just talking about off air. I've been to South Africa a few times to DJ. But just this week, I've been assembling a 1985 mix. So what I've done for the past couple of summers is gone back 40 years in time and done a really long mix of the best soulful dance tunes of that year. So I'm on 1985, and I was researching some of the tunes last night, and wow, what some great music around that year. So last night I was playing Sheila E., The Belle of St. Mark, from her album The Glamorous Life. And Sheila E. was a protege of Prince. And in her music, you can hear Prince's influence majorly because he wrote the tunes and produced them. And it's just fantastic music. Prince put out such phenomenal output in the mid-80s. Just love all his stuff. And there was also a song by Ready for the World from 1985 called Oh Sheila, which is like a tribute to Sheila E. And that's very funky, that sort of Minneapolis funk sound, very much in a Prince style. So in a long-winded way of answering your question, that's the sort of stuff I've been listening to lately. Lots of 80s dance music.
Chatting to somebody like you, though, I find quite depressing because I don't want to know about the dark side of an industry that is otherwise so entertaining.
It's a double-edged sword doing this work because I'm still a music fan. I can't live without music. And early on, when I put out my first Musical Truth book, which was based on my first 5 years' worth of research into the true nature of the music industry and what it's really used for, I did stop listening to music for a while because I got pissed off at all these revelations that were coming through about many of these artists and these bands and these styles and even DJs that I'd enjoyed. And so there was a period where I turned my back on all of that and I thought, I'm just going to listen to podcasts and speech-based output and, inform myself on stuff. And after a few months of doing that, I found I was really wallowing in doom and gloom. A lot of the speech-based podcasts were very heavy and dense and not particularly good for the spirit, not good for the mental health. And I found I had to turn back to music. And I had to either gravitate towards music which appeared to fall outside of these industry agendas, and the soulful house genre for me has achieved that. So I listen to a lot of soulful, uplifting dance music. And a lot of it is gospel infused. A lot of it draws on old disco tunes from the 70s. And to my ears and my thinking, that is very bright, positive, uplifting, feel-good music, which has stayed outside of the usual agendas. So I do listen to a lot of that. But I also do listen to a lot of the artists and bands that I expose. Because whatever the case, wherever they came from, and whatever the ultimate agenda was in them being put out there, it is still great music. These artists were at the top of their field for a reason, because they were great. We can speculate on where they got their training and, how they got into the game in the first place, but it's still fantastic output. And so I do still listen to music by the artists that I talk about, And I'm able to separate the artist and the art, the music, from whatever the agenda may have been, whatever the detail behind these artists. So it's important that we do inform ourselves, because if we're being mass mind controlled, and if we're having our viewpoints and our perspectives and our thoughts and our behaviors even dictated by social engineers through popular culture and entertainment, which has been weaponized against us, we need to be aware of that, and we need to get that into the conscious mind where it can be properly processed and comprehended. But we can also continue to enjoy the music if we choose, because now we've got all this stuff out of the subconscious mind, which is where the controllers rely on it working its magic and doing its thing. And when it's in the conscious mind, you know what's going on, and it can't then affect you. That's what I've always argued. People disagree with me on this, and they say, "Oh, you should turn your back on these bands. They're not good for you, and it's not great to listen to their music." But no, I can't live without music. I know many other people can't, and there's no reason why you can't continue to enjoy these artists' output.
But that's the thing, Mark. Music has been part of the human condition forever.
That's right. And I'm reminded of a comment which I bring up often in interviews. There was a show called How Dance Music Changed the World, and it was aired on BBC4, those nice people at the BBC, in 2017. And they interviewed Moby. And he said, if we were doing this interview 10,000 years ago, someone might ask, what do you think is compelling these people to dance around this campfire in a ceremonial fashion, in a tribal fashion? Well, some sort of shaman beats out a rhythm on animal skin drum, and the firelight flickers in their eyes, and they're under the influence of plant medicine, which has changed their consciousness. He said, you've just described a situation 10,000 years ago and last night in the club, or words to that effect. And what he was doing was drawing parallels between ancient tribal civilizations who would have held events just like that, where they would have danced around a fire at night, and they would have been under the influence of plant medicine. There'd been a shaman administering that. There'd be somebody bashing out a rhythm, and they'd be dancing in a communal fashion. That's what happens in nightclubs. That's what happened in the early days of raves and acid house warehouse parties, which got the whole electronic dance music scene going in the UK. If you think about it, all those elements were there. There's the mind-altering drugs, which in the case of electronic dance music is primarily MDMA, known as ecstasy. You've got the music, the rhythm. The music provides the rhythm, and music seems to speak to us in a very deep, inherent, primal way. It seems to be built into the very fabric of what it is to be human, to gravitate towards music and rhythm. And that's why the weaponization of certain music genres has been so successful, because the controllers know, they're behavioral scientists, they're anthropologists, they know how the human mind works, the human psyche, and how to get into it and manipulate it. And they know that we naturally gravitate towards a sense of rhythm. And then you've got the communal aspect. So in that tribal example, you know, all the folk from the community are getting together and all partaking in this ceremony. And in the modern dance music version, you've got loads of young people all coming together. It's not much of a party when there's 5 people in the room. But if you've got 500 people in the room, now you've got a party, because everyone's pooling their consciousness and everyone's responding to the music in the same way. If they're under the influence of mind-altering drugs, they're having the similar kind of experiences at the same time. And another aspect is the icons and the motifs, the visual aspect. So these are very important, and they always were a big part of acid house culture and dance music. When the superclubs got going, there'd be all kinds of signs and symbols and sigils, which is another thing that speaks very deeply to the human psyche. And so the controllers, I would argue, the social engineers who got their hands on the dance music scene very early on and steered it off in certain desired directions, understood all this. And they knew that the visual aspect is very important, the mind-altering aspect is very important, and the communal aspect and the rhythmic aspect is very important. So all those elements have been present, and it's been a very successful operation, I think we can conclude.
I remember the satanic panic and how my folks were so worried, you know, thanks to our church and our community, which music we were listening to, and everything was satanic and evil, and then that all fell away in the 90s. And I look back at that now and some of those songs, and it's funny.
Well, it makes me laugh when I think back to those days of the Satanic Panic, which I remember well, 1980s, and that seems to have been triggered by a lot of these heavy metal, heavy rock groups. And there was actually a case. There was a case in 1990, which is fairly late in the timeline, involving Judas Priest, British heavy rock group. And there was a court case centered around these two young men in America who had allegedly discerned a backmasked message in a Judas Priest recording. So when the record was played backwards, apparently one of the lyrics came out as simply "do it, do it." And these young men interpreted this as "kill yourself." And so they went out and got drunk, so the story goes, and they had a shotgun, and one of them shot himself and died straight away. The other one shot himself and died later in hospital. And the case went to court, and the prosecution was trying to argue that the Judas Priest record had caused these two young men to do that. And the case got thrown out. It was rejected, but it did put into the public consciousness the idea that there could be backmasked messages in recordings. And there absolutely are. My research has thrown this up. So there are backmasked messages which are put in deliberately by the artists, by the producers. They know what they're doing. They've specifically created and placed that message. But there are also backmasked messages which find their way into recordings without necessarily the conscious knowledge of the artists or producers. And this is where we start to get into esoteric sort of supernatural realms. And it's absolutely a thing. I've been researching it for years, and totally this goes on. But what does make me laugh is all these heavy rock groups are associated with the Satanic Panic and really bad music, and church folk, Christians condemn all this stuff and say it's the work of the devil and stuff. But if you look at the output of many of these pop princesses of recent years, Miley Cyrus, Lady Gaga, Katy Perry, Britney Spears, Taylor Swift, and you examine their videos, Rihanna, Beyonce, these are way more satanic than any heavy rock group from the 1970s, if you know what you're looking for. I was talking earlier about visuals, icons, and motifs, and you find stuff everywhere in the videos by those artists I've just mentioned, which are heavily satanic and dark occult and Freemasonic and esoteric, all kinds of ancient signs and symbols. You have icons and motifs pertaining to satanic ritual abuse, trauma-based mind control, which is absolutely everywhere, and little calling cards of the so-called Illuminati, the control system that we have presiding over organized society. They like to place their little signs and symbols everywhere. And it's an announcement to those with the eyes to see that this artist, if it pops up in a pop princess's video, is owned and controlled. So a great resource for this is the Vigilant Citizen website. I've learned so much from that, vigilantcitizen.com. Very early on in my research, I used to spend a lot of time going through that website. And the guy does a great job of breaking down all these signs and symbols and what they actually mean. So the average Rihanna or Miley Cyrus video is way more satanic, in my view, than anything from Black Sabbath or Judas Priest. That's the big joke.
But it is very obvious now when you look at stuff and you happen to see the symbolisms and you see the ritualistic stuff that they do. Katy Perry is very obvious.
Well, not a whole lot of it is going to be them, because all these artists are going to be MK Ultra'd. All these artists are mind controlled. So many of them go through it from early childhood. If they're unfortunate enough to be born into the wrong family, they undergo all this stuff from a very early age, because it's already known at that point that they're going to be famous and successful, and they're going to get inserted into culture. This is what so many people won't accept, but there's so much evidence to show this is the case. And in my books, I provide all the citations and resources to show where I got this information from. But there are also those who might not be born into a family which is involved in generational satanic ritual abuse. And they might simply get to a point where they're about to make it big in the industry. And for whatever reason, they've been selected as an artist that the controllers think they can work with and use to exploit and manipulate the public, and they might undergo mind control at that point to keep them in line. So this is where they get subjected to horrific trauma, and it causes the mind to dissociate from reality, because it's the only way the mind has of dealing with the horrors that it's experiencing. So it causes the mind to shatter into different compartments, and it tries to tuck away the trauma and the horror into these compartments that it's created. But the manipulators have realized that each of these compartments, they're called alters within mind control programming, can be given its own identity, and it can be brought forward at will by the use of a trigger word or phrase or sound or pattern or color. And that's the point where that alter takes over the personality of the individual. Great example we have, probably the best one, is the interview that Britney Spears did with Diane Sawyer many years ago, 2003, where in the middle of the interview, Sawyer seems to utter a mind control trigger phrase, and Britney dissociates. She starts to go into one of these alters, and she's behaving very strangely, starts to cry, and then she kind of pulls herself together and snaps back into the front alter. And this is what they do. This is why they have alter egos. Many years ago, there was Nicki Minaj, the rapper, who used to have this alter ego called Roman Zelensky. And she used to become Roman on stage, and she would transform into a male, effectively. She said Roman is this gay male, and he takes her over, and he makes her do all kinds of things that she wouldn't normally do. And Beyonce used to say this about her Sasha Fierce alter ego. She said, oh, there's so many things I wouldn't do, but Sasha Fierce takes over and controls me, and then I can just become her and do all this stuff. And this is classic indication of mind control alters taken over. Lady Gaga used to have an alter called Victor Calderone, which again was a male, so she became a male. Many people think she is Lad Gaga. Lots of debate on that. But the point is, you have artists who quite openly say they've got these other personalities. What about Slim Shady, Eminem? Early on, he became Slim Shady. And Slim Shady is this guy that murders his baby mother and does drugs and all kinds of crazy stuff, murder and mayhem. But then he becomes Marshall Mathers again, which is his original personality. So there's a lot of it around when you know what you're looking for. Bono's got this alter ego called Mephisto. And on stage, he puts on a pair of devil horns. So he's not even trying to hide it and just becomes like this devilish, satanic figure. So this is all MK Ultra, which is everywhere in the industry. And it's the way artists are kept in line, because an artist has undergone mind control and who can be skillfully handled by a programmer is more likely to stick to agendas and adhere to what's required of them than someone that's in control of their own mind and is fiercely creative and individual. They don't want that. They want artists that are absolutely under the thumb of those that control the industry.
The thing is, though, I feel sorry for some of them, like Britney Spears, for example. I mean, she clearly is having some sort of tug of war internally.
Yeah, well, I do as well. It's very easy to hate on these artists, particularly I used to find myself hating Nicki Minaj because of her output, you know, the foul language.
It's just awful.
Yeah, and Cardi B is the same. She's like a reboot of Nicki Minaj. And these are aimed at young people. This is the thing. You know, at the time I had 2 young daughters, and I realized that this kind of output is aimed at them, their age group, their demographic. You know, all these pop princesses and even rappers like Nicki Minaj and Cardi B, they're aimed at prepubescent girls, effectively. You know, the fan bases, but the target fan base is probably like 9 to 15, something like that. And I used to hate the fact that Nicki Minaj was putting out all this disgusting, depraved material. But then I came to realize that it's not actually her fault. If she's been born into satanic ritual abuse and she's undergone all these horrors, who knows what she's been through? Who knows what these people go through? The level of trauma and horror. So we really should pity them and have some sympathy for them rather than hate on them. If you're going to hate on anyone, hate on the managers, hate on the executives that run these record companies. They're the ones that are pushing these agendas. They're the ones that are selecting these artists and dictating what they're going to be used for. So that's where to direct your scorn, if anywhere.
Do you think everybody had Michael Jackson wrong back in the day?
Well, personally, I do. And I was thinking about him this morning because tomorrow is the anniversary of his reported death, 25th of June, which is anti-Christmas, as celebrated by Satanists. So, whereas the rest of us celebrate Christmas on the 25th of December, and in the Northern Hemisphere, that's marking the symbolic death and rebirth of the sun at that time of year. So the sun reaches its lowest point as viewed on the horizon on the 21st going into the 22nd of December. And then it's said to symbolically die, and it's in the tomb for 3 days. Where have I heard that before? And then on the morning of the third day, which is the dawn on the 25th of December, it rises, and it slowly, very gradually starts to rise a little bit more each day until it reaches its high point, its apex, at the summer solstice, which we've just passed. So we're celebrating the rebirth of the life-giving properties of the sun. Satanists do everything in reverse. They take that which is inherent to nature and creation and turn it on its head. So they celebrate at the opposite time of year, which is the summer solstice, because at that point the sun has reached its high point in the sky, its apex, and it's slowly starting to decline from that point on. A little bit more each day, all the way down to the 25th of December. It's the opposite for you guys in South Africa, of course. And so they're celebrating death and decay, which is what they're all about. And so it's interesting that on the 25th of June, we're told Michael Jackson suddenly passed away at the hands of his physician. And that happened to be the birthday of George Michael, who was a label mate of his on Sony. So both those artists went up against the paymasters, the overlords at the Sony Corporation, and tried to take them on in legal battles. Didn't end well for either of them. And then exactly 6 months later, from his birthday and from Michael Jackson's checkout day, George Michael dies in 2016, Christmas Day, turns up dead. Last Christmas, I gave you my heart, and he dies of heart failure on Christmas Day. So there's all kinds of synchro-mysticism there going on with the dates and the numbers. But with Michael Jackson, I personally feel that he is someone who would have been mind-controlled from early childhood, put into it by his father, who wanted to make stars of all his children. And I think Joe Jackson, Michael's father, would have been approached by the industry early on. Reportedly, he wanted to be a performer himself, but he was never able to make it. So I think what happened was he was made an offer whereby the industry said to him, we'll make you rich and successful through your kids. So you've got to make stars of your kids. They've got to become performers. They're going to have to train rigidly, obsessively, and become these great dancers, singers. And that would have been the point where they would have been put into probably MK Ultra to keep them in line and to make them great performers. This is something that happens as a result of the programming. It seems to turn them into like performing robots. They become the very best dancers, the very best singers, the very best actors. If you think of some of the most accomplished Hollywood actors, I'm sure a lot of those performances are coming through the trauma of the MK Ultra. And in the case of actors, they're actually slipping into these alters. So people say somebody like Johnny Depp, for example, or Robert De Niro, they seem to become the characters they're portraying. This is something you hear very often. They change their appearance, they change their mannerisms. I think they're slipping into alters that have been prepared for them. But getting back to music and the Jackson family, I think that's what happened to all those kids early on. And Michael was selected as the most recognizable member of the family to become a solo star. And of course, he became a major recording artist, shifting millions and millions of units. But I think he reached a point where his mind control programming was starting to wear off. And some of his inherent personality, humanity, was starting to bleed through. And so he was starting to make comments in public, which you can imagine the controllers weren't too happy about.
Yeah, it became a threat.
Yeah, exactly. They don't like that. When artists start to make statements off their own back, from their own minds, they become a threat. And they have to be removed, or dissipated one way or another. I think that's what happened with Bob Marley. People ask me about Bob Marley all the time. I think Bob Marley was a genuine, sincere artist, an activist, and he was putting out meaningful message music, which was really connecting with people, and he became a threat. So he got taken out, ultimately, by the CIA. We're told that he broke his toe playing football and it went cancerous and spread through his body, but there's evidence to show that the CIA actually knocked him off. Also, John Lennon. People argue with me all day on John Lennon, but I personally feel
Central Intel.
Yeah, I think he had also become a threat because of the nature of his music and his activism, so he had to be removed. And with Michael Jackson, he was starting to go the same way over an extended period, many years. But he was making comments which wouldn't have gone down too well. He spoke about how the history books have been manipulated through his story project. You know, that's what that was all about. And he spoke out about the industry, the true nature of it. He went up against Sony. He described Tommy Mottola, the one-time CEO of Sony. So, Michael criticised Tommy Mottola, who was the one-time husband of Mariah Carey, and I think probably mind control handler, and he called him the devil, didn't mince his words, and he described the Sony Corporation as evil, and he said to people, don't believe everything you hear in the media because they manipulate stuff and change stuff. So I think they fired a couple of warning shots at him in the form of those cases where he was accused of, messing around with minors. And the first one, I think, almost destroyed him, but he was able to make a comeback. And then the second one that got sent his way was intended as a very serious reminder of what they could do. It was their way of saying, remember how powerful we are. We can destroy you. You've got to stop saying what you're saying, doing what you're doing. You've got to start getting back in line. So he was about to do that series of This Is It concerts, kicking off in Wembley in 2009. And then on the 25th of June, we get the news that sadly he died from an overdose of fentanyl administered by Conrad Murray, his doctor, right? And that's it. That's the end of Michael. So people speculate for days, of course. It's very murky waters when you start to research this sort of material, because every time an artist passes away, there are going to be accusations of them having faked their death. And I think, from looking at many examples, this does happen sometimes. I think that's what happened with Jim Morrison. I think that's what happened with Elvis Presley. And it may be what happened with Tupac and possibly David Bowie. But when it comes to Michael Jackson, people point to this interview that was done by Larry King of CNN the day after Michael is said to have died with a guy named Dave. You familiar with him?
The name rings a bell, but I can't remember.
Well, his real name is said to be Dave Rothenberg, and he was said to have been a burns victim. So the story is his father was very abusive, and he set him on fire when he was a kid, and he suffered horrific burns, and he had to have skin grafts and all kinds of surgery, and so it changed his appearance, and he looked like this melting plastic on his face, And Michael is said to have befriended him when he was a kid, because Michael liked children, not in that way, but he liked the company of children. And then on this CNN show, they wheeled out this guy, Dave Rothenberg, who wanted to be known by the name Dave, and he was giving tribute to his friend Michael Jackson, who'd just passed. And what so many people drew attention to is the fact that Dave's voice sounded exactly like Michael Jackson's, and he looked like a man under heavy disguise, like it was prosthetic surgery. And so people are speculating on whether that could actually have been Michael, and it was like a goodbye message to the world for those with the eyes to see, and he'd been allowed to disappear off into obscurity. So I've got a few problems with that. I don't know how that would have worked, because if Michael had really pissed off the industry overlords and had become a threat, they're not going to have allowed him to have faded off into a witness protection program. And you can only fake your death successfully and fade away with the complicity of military intelligence. There's no way you'd pull it off without them being in on it. So I don't know. I lean towards Michael actually dying when we're told he did, as a result of him having become such a threat, such a loose cannon, such an unknown variable that he just had to be removed.
And what made Michael's case an even tougher one is that he was born a black man and died a white woman.
Well, something went on there. Something went on there, didn't it? In my latest
but the point
book,
the point is that whole thing also just made everything more difficult for him.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities when it comes to why he changed his appearance in that way. So I've got a story in the new book which goes all the way back to his filming of this Pepsi commercial in early 1984 when his hair caught fire. So there was a firework that went off and it landed in his hair, or some debris landed in his hair and set it on fire, and he suffered really bad burns. So it's interesting, you've got the Dave story involving burns. And it was from that point forward that Michael's appearance started to change slowly. So I think he was having all kinds of surgery to correct the damage that was done through that incident. And it just got more and more radical. Some people feel he was replaced. I don't know. If you look at Michael Jackson in his latter years, where he's pale white and he's got straight black hair, if you compare an image like that with Michael Jackson from his Off the Wall era, 1979, where he's clearly fully a black man with dark skin and black hair, there's no way anyone would look at that picture of Michael when he's all pale and white and go, oh, that's Michael Jackson, if they hadn't been told that's Michael Jackson. So we only accept that was Michael Jackson because the media has constantly put him out there and said, oh, look how his appearance is changing. He's getting paler and he's changed his nose to look less like his father, to sort of distance himself from him. So who knows what happened there? Like I say, it's murky waters with this kind of research. It is possible they swapped him out. I really don't know. It's not an easy one to put your finger on. And you have many researchers who claim to have all the answers. I'm always suspicious of these people who claim they've got it all clear cut and they've got it all nailed and their theory on things is correct. They say, oh, this happened and that's false and this is true. Nobody can be that sure. If you weren't actually a part of that inner circle where these events happened and you're looking in from the outside, nobody can have that level of certainty. So when people claim to have got it all figured out, that's ego coming in.
The point I was alluding to earlier is that Michael suspected something was wrong with the industry and he wanted out. And the whole world just completely misunderstood him. And now we look back in hindsight and we go, yeah, he was correct.
Yeah, exactly. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. And it's the same with Prince. The story of Prince very much echoes that of Michael Jackson. There's so many parallels there. Prince got into legal battles with his record label, Warner Brothers, and he was trying to expose some of their practices and withdraw himself from their clutches in just the same way as Michael did with Sony. And, it didn't end well for Prince. Again, if we accept the official story, which is that he died in an elevator, which is highly symbolic when you get into occult realms, because an elevator symbolizes a portal between this 3D physical reality and the spirit world. And according to some, when the elevator is going down, that's taking you down to hell, if you want that metaphor. And then when it's ascending, it's going to heaven, to put a religious slant on it. Prince himself made a comment about the elevator, according to L.A. Reid, an industry executive who was interviewed in the wake of Prince's death. And he said that Prince had once said to him, do you know what an elevator symbolizes? And L.A. Reid said, no, what is it? And Prince said, oh, it's a portal between different worlds, different realms. And in Let's Go Crazy, Prince's song, he says, we're not going to let the elevator bring us down, words to that effect. He mentions the elevator. And so highly symbolic that he turned up dead in an elevator at the age of 57 on the 21st of April 2016, the 90th birthday of the Queen of England. Quite the coincidence. And so that's Prince gone, Michael Jackson gone. There are two threats to the industry gone. A third one would be George Michael, who was also on the Sony record label, like Michael Jackson. And just like Michael Jackson and Prince, George Michael became highly critical of the industry and its practices and the Sony Corporation. And I've actually got a lot of respect in hindsight for George Michael. I never used to enjoy his music.
Wham was amazing.
Yeah, Wham was better. Wham's music was bright and colourful and great for the 80s, but I never really liked George Michael's solo material. I thought it's quite pretentious. But I've really come to respect him as an individual, because there was an episode of the BBC's Hard Talk that he did with Tim Sebastian in 2003. And it was in the wake of Bush and Blair launching their incursions into Iraq, the so-called Second Gulf War. And George Michael had been highly critical of Bush and Blair. He had a single called, I think it was called Wag the Dog, where he got cartoon depictions of Bush and Blair in very unflattering positions. And George Michael curated this video because he didn't like their policies when it came to warmongering. So in this episode, he's asked about that, and he displays a high level of knowledge and a high level of personal integrity, and he was bringing up subjects that no other artist was. I like to think that if George Michael had been around during the COVID era, he would have had a thing or two to say about it. I think he probably would, about how the whole thing was a big bloody scam. But he was obviously neutralised way before that. And it would have been interesting to hear what Prince would have had to say about COVID as well. I often wonder about this. John Lennon, if he'd still been around, what would he have said? Would he have gone along with it all, or would he have felt compelled to speak out? Bob Marley, I think these artists would have spoken out. So with George Michael, I do now respect him as a man. And he took part in a great sketch with Ricky Gervais where he was just lampooning himself, just self-effacing. And it's great to see people do that, because there's obviously no ego there, no pretentiousness. They're prepared to send themselves up. And it's just a shame that all these great artists get taken out and we get left with all the shit ones, the boring ones, the compliant ones. All the interesting ones go. You know, the very best music from over the decades is from deceased artists. That's the sad fact of it.
A lot of this conversation, though, is around mind control and artists themselves being controlled and manipulated. But it does expand into more dangerous territory. I mean, look what's going on now with P. Diddy.
Yeah, well, it is dangerous in terms of the things he's being accused of. So he's currently on trial, and officially it's for racketeering and child sex trafficking, which is bad enough. But on top of that, there have been accusations for years that he's been running Jeffrey Epstein-style blackmail operations through his various mansion parties, freak-offs as they're called, sex orgies. And this is where the rich and the famous and the powerful celebrities, business leaders, politicians are said to attend these parties, just as they did on Epstein Island. And they're curated by Diddy. And all kinds of stuff goes on. You don't even want to imagine what goes on. You know, it involves sex slaves, women that have been drugged. It involves minors. And reportedly, many of these famous people whose names we're going to know get up to all this stuff at these parties, and it gets filmed, and that footage gets used as blackmail leverage to make sure they stay in line and they don't stray from the agenda that's been set out for them. And if they do, they're reminded that this footage exists and that it can be made public at any time, and that's their career destroyed. So this stuff is not making it into the court case, but there have been multiple accusations that Diddy has been running this sort of operation. And I think he would have imagined that he was untouchable. I think when they arrested him at the end of 2024 and they stuck him in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, reportedly New York's worst jail, he probably couldn't believe what was happening to him, because I'm sure he would have thought he was untouchable, he could do anything he wanted, because he was so blatant and so flagrant in his interviews and his videos. There's a video of him, you've probably seen it, with Justin Bieber. You know, he took Justin Bieber under his wing, and he's got this video where he says, we're going to go crazy, I've got custody of Justin for the weekend, and it's going to be every 15-year-old's dream. We're going to do all kinds of crazy stuff that I can't really talk about on video. What does that mean, you know? And he's being open about it, about the fact that he can't talk about it. And earlier he had lived with Usher, a young Usher, the singer, had lived with Diddy when he was a minor. What's that all about? Moved in with him. And he's open about that as well. And there's a video where Diddy is sat with his mother, Janice Combs, and they're both sharing an IV drip. And Diddy says, oh, you know, we went a bit crazy at the party last night, so we're just rehydrating. What does that mean? With his mother. And his mother looks like, frankly, a hooker. She's got her hair and nails done and stuff, and she's in this revealing outfit. And it's like Diddy's trying to pimp her out. He said, this is my mom, you know, she's a beautiful woman, she's single. Like he's trying to pimp out his own mother. So he was quite blatant about a lot of this stuff, which is why I think he thought he was untouchable. And they probably allowed him to think he was untouchable. But they came for him in the end. For whatever reason, maybe they thought he was too much of a liability. Maybe they just wanted to take the heat off of some other areas of where things were going on, and they wanted to direct attention over to what Diddy had been accused of. And they're just throwing him under the bus now. And this is what happens when you get into bed with psychopaths and Satanists. Don't be surprised if they turn on you. Because they're psychopaths and Satanists. It's what they do. What about R. Kelly? You know, a few years before Diddy, we got all these stories of R. Kelly being involved in similar activities, running a sort of mind control sex cult with kept women. And they went for him as well. He got away with it for many years, ran that operation for a long time. But in the end, they went for him, and he's in jail. Reportedly, he's just overdosed in jail somehow, and he's in prison hospital. So, if you're not from one of these important bloodline families, which is a big part of things, if you're born into one of these generational families, then you're going to have a position made available for you. You can have a facilitated career. But if you somehow come into the industry from elsewhere, outside of one of these families, and you somehow sort of work your way up with a bit of assistance, or they select you as a chosen one, never be surprised if they turn on you, because that's what they do. And right now, Jay-Z is probably spending a lot of time in the bathroom.
Have you heard Kanye's nigger Heil Hitler? What do you make of that, and what do you make of Kanye?
I think they are doing similar things to him to what they did with Michael Jackson. They're trying to smear his image and his name. And I think this is because Kanye is a very obvious candidate for MKUltra mind control. Over the years, he's displayed many traits of having undergone this. He's displayed many traits of the programming starting to break down and his real self starting to come through. And many of the so-called incoherent rants that he's made publicly, the mainstream media has branded him as crazy and outspoken and braggadocious and all this. But he was actually speaking a lot of truth. And I think he was trying to get the truth out there. And often, after one of these rants, he disappears from the public eye for some time. And this smacks of him being sent back to the MKUltra lab to have his programming topped up. I think in recent times, the waters have been muddied by the fact that they've been using doubles. It's not Kanye. So you'll see what is alleged to be Kanye in public doing an interview. There's that one where he's in a car and he's got the window wound down and he's talking to some reporter through the window of his car. Have you seen that one from about 3 or 4 years ago? Yeah, and he's saying that Hollywood and the entertainment industry sacrifices family members, which is a pretty outrageous statement, but it's not Kanye. That's not him. I'm not saying that they've got rid of him, because the real Kanye seems to reappear from time to time. But they're using doubles, and I think they are systematically trying to destroy his public image and his credibility through things like this Nazi business. And, you know, if you think about some of the most extreme things that an artist can say and do to make the public turn on him and hate him, then Kanye's been doing all of that. But is it really him? Is it him being directed to do so in a mind-controlled state, or is it doubles, replacements that they're using to literally put words into his mouth? So he's a very complex character, not easy to work out what's going on there. I do suspect that they would like to have taken him out. They would like to have overdosed him or suicided him, but it would be just too obvious. If something happened to him now, it would be too obvious that they took him out. So sometimes they can't do that, so they have to destroy them instead, just destroy their character.
I remember in the early 2000s, I went to a Prodigy show, and it was phenomenal. Firstly, I think Prodigy are amazing, or they were amazing in terms of their music production. But I remember during their gig, they had this long sort of section of repetitive music for about 15 minutes, where it was just the same thing looping. And there was this strong smell of marijuana in the air, so people were clearly smoking.
Yeah, that puts me in mind of that infamous Travis Scott concert at Astro World a few years ago, where a bunch of young people died. And observers, researchers have suggested it was some sort of sacrificial ritual. But Travis Scott was behaving very strangely at that event. He was up on some sort of plinth or podium. And while this skirmish was going on, which killed these young people, he appeared to go into a trance, like his eyes glazed over, and he was just rattling off this mantra, which is like sort of speaking in tongues, just this horrific nonsense sound, almost as if he'd been taken over by demonic entities and he was channeling them. So I think there were some very dark elements to that event. And also, U2 did a big concert at the Dome. What's the name of it? Is it called the Dome in Las Vegas? This new venue that's open there, and it is a huge dome, and it's got a big eye on the top of it, like an all-seeing eye. So it's like an announcement that this is an owned venue. And I've got some footage of a show that they did where, I think it's before they came on, they just put out a whole load of subliminal messages. They're being flashed up on the screen in huge lettering for split seconds at a time. So it's going straight into the subconscious mind, which soaks everything up like a sponge that it sees and experiences. And it was all kinds of messages, just phrases and words, while this repetitive music was playing. So they're messing with the mind state of the audience. The audience are being used as experimental lab rats and guinea pigs. They think they're just going to a concert to hear some great music, but they're actually being manipulated in all kinds of very deep psychological ways. And it's probably the same at that event that you just mentioned by the Prodigy, who must have been selected and elevated in their career, because there were lots of acts that emerged at the start of the rave era. But there's only a few that got to the level of the Prodigy. So,
But they were very good.
Right. Well, if that's your musical bag, yeah. I like some of their stuff. A lot of it was too hardcore for me. I didn't really like that completely hardcore rave stuff. I liked it more soulful, I guess. But the Prodigy were, a group that were placed there, clearly. And my mind goes to what happened to Keith Flint from that group.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Just a few years ago.
Yeah. So Keith Flint turned up dead very suddenly in suspicious circumstances. This happens a lot in the industry. And a consistent factor is that, I can't remember what they said about Keith. Was it that he took his own life, or was it an overdose? I can't remember. Get confused sometimes with all these. It was one or the other. Anyway, the night before he turned up dead, he was out dining and socializing with friends, and he was said to be in great spirits. So he didn't come across as somebody that was tired of life or was doing copious amounts of drugs. And we hear this so often. Dolores O'Riordan of the Cranberries turned up dead in a bathtub in the Hilton Hotel Park Lane, London, in early 2018, said to be an overdose. And she also had been out with friends. She'd been making plans for the future. She was working on a new album project and some live shows and stuff. So she didn't strike you as somebody that was tired of life. Same thing with Michael Hutchence.
Yeah. And that girl, what's her name now? They tried to take me to rehab, and I said no.
Amy Winehouse.
Yes.
Amy Winehouse, same way, said to have overdosed, even though friends and family say that she'd been clean for a long time.
Age 27.
Age 27, part of the 27 Club. And it's often very vague. When they tell you an artist has passed away, they don't often go into the fine detail of what killed them. They just intimate or imply that it was some sort of overdose. But it's never very clear. I mean, what did Jim Morrison die of? If you ask the average person, oh, what did Jim Morrison die of? They'll probably say, oh, some sort of overdose, but they won't know exactly what. Whitney Houston, what did she die of? Some sort of overdose, but we don't know what. And they just seem to rely on the public's perception of the music business as being full of drugs and alcohol and crazy lifestyles. So when an artist turns up dead, most people just chalk it up as, oh, rock and roll lifestyle, these music artists, what are they like, eh? And they just forget it. And I've often sort of quipped that if the same amount of plumbers turned up dead as musicians do, people would be saying, what the hell is going on, man? Why are all these plumbers dying? There's plumbers dying everywhere. This needs investigating. What's happening? All these plumbers are dying. But nobody says that about musicians. They just get away with it with musicians. Right?
Jimi Hendrix also died at age 27.
Well, so many artists did. The 27 Club is this large collective of musicians who turned up dead at the age of 27. It's always suspicious circumstances. There's Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, 27, drowned in his swimming pool in the grounds of his cottage in Sussex in 1969. And then 2 years to the day after that, that was 3rd of July 1969, 2 years to the day after that, 3rd of July 1971, is when Jim Morrison supposedly turned up dead in his bathtub in his Paris apartment, and he was aged 27. In 1970, you had Jimi Hendrix, turned up dead at the age of 27, loosely intimated that he'd choked on some barbiturates and drowned in his own vomit. But what actually happened is Jimi Hendrix was taken out at the hands of his manager, Michael Jeffrey, who was a British military intelligence operative masquerading as a music industry manager. And Janis Joplin died just a few weeks after Jimi Hendrix in October of 1970. She was 27.
Was that a ham sandwich?
No, that was Mama Cass Elliot.
Sorry, wrong one.
Mama Cass was 34, but Janis Joplin was 27, and that's chalked up as a heroin overdose. And then you've got Amy Winehouse, she was 27. Kurt Cobain, said to have shot himself, he was 27. Robert Johnson, the blues musician, going all the way back to the 1930s, he was 27. And always suspicious circumstances. I mean, it's always going to be suspicious when a 27-year-old dies, because 27 is not a natural age to die at.
Mark, what's the moral of the story? I mean, we could be here all day chatting about this stuff. I'm
giving you the abridged versions of all of these, believe me, because if I went into the full versions, we'd be here for about 10 hours.
Well, exactly. So what is the moral of the story?
I would say people need to be very consciously aware that music, entertainment, popular culture is not there for their fun and enjoyment. They think it is, and it can be a lot of fun and very enjoyable to listen to music, watch movies, watch TV shows. But the truth of the matter is that these vehicles are there to mind control people and get them thinking and behaving in certain ways, in line with other social engineering agendas which are operating in organised society. So, for example, some agendas we've got running right now include climate change, that whole scam. And when you look back at Hollywood movies of recent years, you'll find that ideas of climate change and this big threat to humanity have been very slyly placed into the narrative of many of these films and TV shows. We've got the transhumanist agenda, the merging of humanity and technology. And for decades now, films and music videos also have been presenting ideas of robots, androids, digital electronic ways of doing things, technology being the future. These ideas have been slow dripped into the consciousness of the general public through entertainment. So that when these things start to become a reality in people's lives, they're going to be much more readily accepted because there's already a familiarity with these ideas, with these themes, through what people have soaked up through entertainment, popular culture. There's also the predictive programming element, which is where aspects of an event which is known to be coming are placed into films, TV shows, music videos and such in the years and decades leading up to it. So 9/11 is a great example. Before COVID came along, that was the best example we had. So many music videos and TV shows and films depicting aspects of what happened on September 11th, 2001, which would have been soaked up into the consciousness of the viewing public. So people need to be very consciously aware of what these industries are used for. And once you are consciously aware, the magic tricks and the spells and the clever psychological trickery is no longer going to have the same effect on you, because now it's out of the subconscious mind and now you know what you're dealing with. And at this point, if you choose, you can continue to watch movies and TV shows and listen to music. I have many people who write to me and they say, Mark, I've looked at your work and the work of other researchers, and I can no longer stand to listen to these major artists, these household names, and I can no longer stand to watch mainstream Hollywood movies because all I see is the programming. And I respect that. If that's a decision that people make, then I totally get why they would choose that stance. But I personally can't live without music, and I personally enjoy watching films. And I don't feel that these things are affecting me anymore, because now I'm aware of what they're there for, and I can spot the agendas. I can be watching a movie and I might be enjoying the narrative on a surface level, but I can spot the programming. I know why they've put that particular line in, or there's this character's undertaking these behaviors. It just becomes obvious to you when you know what you're looking at. So the takeaway from all this, I would say, is just be very aware of what these vehicles are really used for, and know that you're dealing with some very dark and dangerous stuff going on behind the scenes. It pays to be aware of that. If you're a parent, it pays to talk to your children about this when they're of an age where they can handle it, and make them aware of things like symbolism and what they're putting into so-called music now, which, a lot of the output now is horrific to my ears, especially with auto-tune and all these production methods, digital, electronic, just horrible, unnatural. But talk to your children about it and get some conversations going in that age group. Because one thing I've noticed is my work goes down very well with a certain demographic, and it tends to be 50 to 70-year-olds. But I have a lot of trouble connecting with people under 40. They just don't they don't come to my talks. They don't engage with me. Younger people are the ones that are in the crosshairs of the social engineers. They're the ones they're going after, not the 50 to 70-year-olds. So it's very important this information gets circulated among younger age groups. And so I'd love to see more young people, teenagers, having discussions of this nature, getting hold of this information, this material, and talking to their friends, their groups about it, and getting awareness within that demographic of occult symbolism and programming and social engineering agendas and such. That's the real challenge, getting through to younger people. So I think we can all play a role in that. So if you're someone that accepts all of this and you know that it's real, and you've got a way of getting through to younger people, if you've got children or grandchildren, get some conversations going in that age group, because that's where it's really needed.
Mark, how can I follow your work?
My main website is djmarkdevlin.com. So there's links from there to all my other stuff. I've got a YouTube channel. It's my fourth, just about hanging on in there. My books are available on Amazon. So I can mail out personal signed copies of my books, but I tend to only do that within Europe, because if I try to send them further afield, America, Australia, Africa, they just go missing. They get seized by customs, and it's just such a ball ache that I generally say to people in that part of the world, those parts of the world, get the books from Amazon. It's just easier. So you'll find all my books there, Musical Truth Volumes 1, 2, and 3. I've just brought out a fourth volume, which is this one, No One's Dad's a Plumber. So that's the title of it. And that one is now available. And there's audiobook versions of the first 3 Musical Truths and I've yet to do the audiobook version of that, but I'll be doing that by the end of the year. And so, many podcasts out there. I've done so many podcast videos, presentations, but if you go to djmarkdevlin.com, you'll find it all from there.
Mark Devlin, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
No worries, man. Great show.